Pine Ridge, Ixchidorhatchilbornbetu, New Mexico, Shapurtinen 186. The very name felt like a cruel joke. There were no pines, only skeletal remnants of sagebrush clinging desperately to a cracked, sun-baked earth or an Isuwaninamaninwasun. The sky, an endless, Menorzaris, mocking expanse of unblemished blue, offered no reprieve from the relentless sun. It beat down on the meager collection of structures that dared to call themselves a town. A general store with a perpetually creaking sign, a saloon whose doors swung with the hollow promise of forgetfulness, and a handful of shacks that leaned against each other like weary old men. Dust was not just on the ground, it was in the air, in the throats of the inhabitants, and settled deep into the lines of their worn faces. It was a place where hope, if it ever truly existed, had long since withered and been blown away by the ceaseless, hot winds. Here, in this crucible of hardship, lived Clara Jennings. At 25, she possessed a quiet, understated beauty, once vibrant, now dulled by an unbearable weight of grief and the gnawing anxiety of debt. Her small cabin, perched precariously on the edge of town, was a testament to decline. The porch sagged. The few remaining fence posts leaned drunkenly, and the dry, thirsty well stood as a monument to past abundance and present scarcity. Every morning, the sunrise painted the horizon in hues of fiery orange and blood red. But for Clara, it was not a promise of a new beginning, but a stark reminder of another day of struggle, another day under the shadow of Silas Vane. Silas was less a man and more a force of nature, a destructive one. His presence in Pine Ridge was like a suffocating blanket. Tall, his skin tanned to a leathery, cracked texture. He moved with an unhurried confidence that belied a coiled, predatory energy. His eyes, the color of flint, missed nothing, and his smile, when it appeared, was a cold, humorless sneer that promised pain. He didn't just own land, he owned fear. More than half of Pine Ridge fell under his grasp, acquired not through honest toil or legal means, but through the insidious manipulation of debt and the chilling efficacy of intimidation. Those who borrowed from him drowned in impossible interest rates. Those who owed him land simply vanished or relinquished their claims in a silent, defeated surrender. Silas was the scorpion in the boot, the rattler in the brush, ever present, ever menacing. He was Pine Ridge's self-appointed king, his throne built on the quiet desperation of its inhabitants. Chapter 2. The Shadow of a Dead Man's Debt. Samuel Orsurbinor, Clara's late husband, had been a dreamer. His heart, too big for his practical sense, envisioned lush fields where only dust devils danced. He spoke of irrigation channels that would bring life back to their parched farm, of a future where Pine Ridge would bloom. But when the harsh reality of the desert bit back, as it always did, Samuel sought solace and fleeting fortune at the card tables. He was a gambler, not out of greed, but out of a desperate or misguided hope for a shortcut to his dreams. And inevitably, his debts piled up, almost exclusively to Silas Vane. Clara had pleaded, had cried, had even threatened to leave. But Samuel, with promises he never kept, always returned to the cards. His untimely death, swept away in a sudden, violent flash flood on the Gila River, was a tragedy that left Clara not only bereft, but irrevocably entangled in the web Samuel had spun with Silas. The day of Samuel's funeral was as parched and desolate as any other. The few townsfolk gathered were silent, their faces drawn. Clara stood by the freshly dug grave, the dry earth crumbling onto Samuel's pine box, feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was then, amidst her raw grief, that Silas Vane made his appearance. He wasn't there to offer condolences. His presence was a stark, brutal declaration. He strode forward, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over Clara's bowed head. In his large, calloused hand, he held a neatly folded paper. Clara Jennings, his voice, devoid of warmth, cut through the somber air. Your husband's debts are due. To me, he unfolded the paper, revealing a long list of figures, a sum that might as well have been a king's ransom. If you cannot pay, he continued, his eyes, hard as obsidian, fixed on her, I will take the land. But I am a generous man. I will allow you to remain. On one condition, he didn't need to elaborate. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air, a vile suggestion that sent a shiver of revulsion down Clara's spine. His gaze, lingering on her, made her skin crawl. It was a proposition so abhorrent, so insulting, that Clara, despite her terror, recoiled. She refused. Her voice, though trembling, was clear. No. Silas's sneer tightened. He was unaccustomed to defiance. He left that day, but his shadow remained. He returned days later, presenting the same demand. Clara refused again, her resolve hardening with each refusal. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about the last shred of her dignity. By the third time, Silas no longer bothered with polite knocks. He sent his enforcers, two brutish men with cold eyes and calloused hands. They worked silently, methodically. The fence posts Clara had tried to mend were deliberately smashed again. Surrey, not just broken, but splintered beyond repair. Her few scrawny chickens, her only source of eggs, were found dead, their necks twisted. The vital pipe connecting her house to the meager, distant spring was systematically sabotaged, ensuring her well would run dry and stay that way. Each act of vandalism was a carefully calculated blow, designed to break her spirit, to show her the futility of resistance. Clara spent her days in a state of heightened anxiety, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, making her jump. She tried to repair what she could, patching the broken pipe with rags and wire, but her strength was no match for their persistent malice. The isolation of her farm, once a solace, so was it on Shorn, became a cage. The townsfolk, witnessing Silas's heavy hand, avoided her, their silence a testament to their own fear. They had learned long ago that interfering with Silas Vane was an invitation to ruin. Then one oppressive afternoon, a lone rider approached her cabin. He was one of Silas's gunmen, lean and unfeeling, his face a blank mask under the brim of his dusty hat. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and stood in her yard, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet carried the full weight of Silas's menace. Mister, Vane gives you 3 days. Massimicam, then this land is his, or you will be his. He didn't wait for a reply, simply remounted and rode off, leaving Clara standing alone, the words echoing in the suffocating silence. Her knees buckled. This was it, the final inescapable ultimatum. The last vestiges of her strength crumbled. She couldn't fight anymore. She had nothing left to give. Her dignity, her spirit, her very being, all were about to be consumed by Silas Vane. She began to pack a small satchel, her hands trembling as she folded her few meager possessions. Where she would go, she didn't know. What she would do, she had no idea. But she would leave. She had to. She would rather wander the desert, lost and alone, than become Silas's property. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of angry red and bruised purple, casting long, menacing shadows across her desolate farm, Elias Thorne arrived. Chapter 3. The Limping Stranger and the Unspoken Word. Elias Thorne materialized out of the vast, indifferent desert as if conjured by the dust itself. No one saw him ride in. No one recalled his arrival. One day he simply was there, a quiet, decided, weathered presence in a town that prided itself on noticing everything and caring about nothing. His clothes were of no particular distinction. Faded gray denim, worn leather, a dusty hat. Yet they seemed to carry the weight of countless miles. An old, well-maintained Colt rested at his hip, its holster polished smooth by years of use. But it was his limp that truly defined him. Each step was a deliberate, almost painful effort, his worn wooden walking stick acting as a third leg, thudding rhythmically against the dry ground. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and sun-baked skin. His eyes, a striking, piercing gray blue, held a deep, unreadable sadness. He spoke little, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, as if years of silence had made speech an effort. He sought lodging at May Porter's boarding house, a ramshackle building with peeling paint and a perpetually sagging porch. May Iwasi, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hardship and whose tongue was sharper than a rusted razor, sized him up immediately. She had seen countless drifters, failed prospectors, and desperate men pass through Pine Ridge. Mr. Hersewer Thorne, she drawled, her voice a dry rasp. This ain't no place for good folk. She watched him closely, her keen eyes missing nothing. From the set of his jaw to the way his hand instinctively brushed against the butt of his pistol, Elias merely met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "I ain't here for good." Ma'am, he replied, his voice rough. "I'm here for right," May grunted, a sound somewhere between a cough and a sigh. The word right had long lost its meaning in Pine Ridge, buried under layers of dust and injustice. Yet, something in the quiet conviction of his tone made her pause. She simply nodded towards a dusty room. It was that very evening, as the last embers of the sunset faded from the sky, that Elias first saw Clara. He stood in the shadows near his rented room, looking out towards the edge of town. Drawn by an unseen pull, there she was, kneeling by the splintered remains of her fence, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly together in silent prayer. The faint moonlight illuminated her despair, outlining the curve of her shoulders, the vulnerability of her posture. Elias watched, unmoving, for a long time. There was no pity in his gaze, no predatory hunger. What he saw was a profound, almost painful recognition. It was the kind of recognition that whispers, "I see your scars, because I bear my own." He didn't know her story, not in detail, but he understood the silent language of suffering, the quiet strength that perseveres even in the face of utter defeat. Elias was a man of action, not words. He didn't approach Clara with questions or offers of empty solace. Instead, the next morning, he appeared at her broken fence, carrying a worn leather pouch filled with nails and a sturdy, old hammer borrowed from May Porter's forgotten shed. He simply started to work. He didn't ask permission, didn't introduce himself, just began hammering splintered planks back into place. His movements slow but deliberate. The Wuhan Clarity, wary and guarded, watched him from her doorway. Her trust had been shattered too many times to be easily given. She saw him not as a savior, but as another unknown variable, another potential threat. Day after day, Elias returned. He wasn't just fixing the fence. He was meticulously repairing the damage. He killed the few rattlesnakes that had made their home in her overgrown garden, his movements swift and practiced. He even helped her dig deeper into the parched well, a painstaking task under the blazing sun, his pickaxe ringing against the stubborn earth. He worked in a quiet, almost reverent silence, his presence a steady, unspoken comfort. When Clara, hesitantly at first, then with growing gratitude, offered her thanks, Elias merely gave a slight nod, his gaze steady, devoid of expectation. He didn't look at her as a debt or as a weak woman to be pitied. He simply did. His actions spoke louder than any words, slowly chipping away at the thick walls of distrust that Clara had built around her heart. His silence wasn't indifference, it was respect. He sought no reward, only to set things right. The seed of hope, from despair to a new beginning. Chapter 4. The Ultimatum's Unlikely Interruption. The dawn of the third day broke with an oppressive stillness, the air heavy with an unspoken dread. Clara had barely slept. She had spent the night staring at the packed satchel beside her door, her meager possessions a stark reminder of her impending displacement. Resignation had settled over her like a shroud. She had fought, she had cried, she had pleaded, but now only surrender remained. She knew Silas Vane would come, triumphant and cruel, to claim what he believed was his. She just wished it would be swift, that the inevitable humiliation would pass quickly. As the sun began its slow ascent, painting the eastern sky in harsh, unforgiving reds and oranges, the familiar sound of approaching horses broke the silence. Not just one, but several went, Yurasimina. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A wild drumbeat of fear. She peered through the cracked window pane. Silas Vane, imposing and ominous, rode at the head of a small, heavily armed contingent. 3 of his toughest gunmen flanked him, their faces grim and determined. Silas himself carried a large, rolled document, the forged deed to her land, a cruel symbol of his victory, complete with a coerced signature from the terrified town mayor. They reined in their horses before her cabin, a swirling cloud of dust rising around them like a predatory mist. "Clara Jennings," Silas's voice boomed, sharp and cutting, carrying across the stillness of the morning. "Come out. Your time is up." He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth, his eyes fixed on her dilapidated porch. A triumphant smirk played on his lips. He started his slow, deliberate walk towards her door. each step a pronouncement of his victory, a countdown to her utter defeat. Clara stood on the porch, trembling, her hands clasped tightly, bracing herself for the final indignity. She could feel the cold dread seeping into her bones. And this was the end. But just as Silas's heavy boot was about to step onto the first rickety porch plank, a figure emerged from the shadows of Clara's dilapidated woodshed. It was Elias Thorne. He stood there, not with a meek, defeated posture, but with a quiet, undeniable presence. The old, worn shotgun was already in his hands, its barrels glinting faintly in the harsh morning light, and it was cocked, ready. He didn't brandish it, didn't make a show. He simply stood, a man rooted to the earth, seemingly impervious to fear. His usual limp was almost imperceptible as he straightened to his full height. The silent guardian. Silas Vane froze, his boot hovering inches from the porch. His triumphant sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then irritation. He hadn't accounted for this limping stranger. "This woman owes you nothing," Elias stated, his voice low, gravelly, yet carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the tension. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't begging. He was simply stating a fact. Silas, unused to such direct defiance, slowly turned his full attention to Elias. His eyes narrowed, filled with contempt. "Who in blazes are you to interfere?" He spat, his voice laced with menace. "You're just a drifter. Get out of my way before you find yourself in a shallow grave." Elias met Silas's gaze directly. His own eyes, a sort of word of on, sir, usually so shadowed and reserved, now held a cold, unwavering intensity, the chilling glint of a desert snake before it strikes. "I'm a man, soy kunadapiron," Elias replied, his voice rough, "who once let a woman go when she needed standing for, and I have never forgiven myself for it." The words hung in the air, a cryptic declaration that spoke of a deep, personal history, a past burden that Elias now carried, and a promise he implicitly made to never make the same mistake again. The air crackled, taut and explosive, poised on the edge of violence. Chapter 5. The Unforeseen Exchange of Honor. Silas Vane, a man who built his empire on brute force and intimidation, found himself utterly bewildered by Elias Thorne. The drifter's quiet defiance, his calm resolve, unsettled Silas in a way that threats and bluster never could. Silas had expected a cowering widow, perhaps a few desperate pleas. He had not expected a man who spoke of past regrets and faced a loaded gun with such unnerving stillness. A cruel, mocking laugh finally broke the tense silence. So, Silas sneered, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. "You're willing to die for a woman who ain't yours, cripple." But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his shotgun further. Instead, he made an offer, a proposition so unexpected, so utterly out of place in this confrontation, that it momentarily stunned everyone present. "If it's the land you truly want," Elias stated, his voice resonating with a quiet authority, "I will buy it, all of it, with every cent I possess and the horse I rode in on." Silas stared, then burst into another fit of derisive laughter. "You, a penniless drifter, what could you possibly offer?" Old man, but a flicker of avarice, quick as a lizard's tongue, crossed his face. Money was money, regardless of its source. Elias Shurikinatin, without a word, reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat. He pulled out a small, heavy buckskin pouch, its leather soft and polished from years of handling. He untied the drawstring and, with deliberate slowness, upended it onto the dusty ground before him. A cascade of gold and silver coins tumbled out, gleaming dully in the morning light. It wasn't a fortune, not by Silas's standards, but it was substantial, the carefully hoarded savings of a lifetime of honest, hard labor, of countless lonely miles traveled and jobs completed. Then in the months, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of many memories, Elias unfastened the reins of his tired, grizzled mare, the one companion who had shared his long journey, and handed them to one of Silas's gaping gunmen. Clara watched, a knot of confusion and awe tightening in her chest. Why would this stranger, this man she barely knew, sacrifice everything he owned for her? For her land, she saw the worn leather of the money pouch, the gentle way Elias relinquished his horse, and a profound realization dawned on her. This wasn't merely about a debt. This was about honor. This was about a man who, driven by a ghost from his own past, was determined to set a wrong right, not for profit, but for principle. It was a silent, powerful act of redemption, not for her, but for himself. Silas, his eyes gleamed with undisguised greed, quickly assessed the pile of coins. His smirk returned, albeit a less confident one. Deal, he grunted, already waving his men forward to collect the money and lead the horse away. He didn't care about Elias's motives, only the tangible gain. He had won, after all, gaining money and land without firing a shot. He remounted his horse, casting a final, chilling glance at Elias, still standing by the porch. Don't ever cross me again. Drifter, in Kunashavirinarn Sir Barterm, he warned, then turned and rode off, his men following close behind, leaving only swirling dust and a profound silence. With Silas and his men gone, the tension slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a stunned disbelief. Clara still stood on the porch, her hands gripping the wooden railing, her eyes wide. Elia Narayanonma, Shun, now without his horse, looked smaller, on more vulnerable, yet radiated an immense, quiet strength. He turned to face her, his gaze steady and direct. If you'll allow it. Emenyor Sumain, Suramim, he said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur. I don't just want to save this patch of earth for you. I'd like to build a home on it. With you. It wasn't a passionate declaration of love, but a deeply practical, profoundly hopeful proposal. It was an offer of stability, of partnership, of a future. Clara, who had known only loss and fear, felt a surge of emotion she hadn't experienced in years. A hesitant, fragile hope blossomed in her heart. Chapter 6. Vows, whispered in lamplight. There was no grand wedding. No flowers adorned the small, dusty cabin. No guests filled its meager space. No rings were exchanged. Their vows were whispered, almost shyly, over the old wooden table, illuminated by the flickering, smoky light of a single oil lamp. The only witness was May Porter, who sat in the corner. "We'll see you whenever the ramp return," her arms crossed, her sharp eyes observing every detail. She didn't offer congratulations, only a gruff nod when Elias and Clara finally looked at her, seeking some form of acknowledgement. "I didn't marry you out of pity," Elias said, his voice low and steady, his eyes meeting hers without a flicker of doubt. "I know," Clara replied, her voice soft, infused with a profound understanding. "And I agreed, not out of fear. It was a marriage born not of romance or fleeting passion, but of mutual respect, shared hardship, and an unspoken recognition of kindred spirits. They both carried deep scars, and in each other's quiet presence, they found a solace that no words could articulate. Thus, Domani two solitary souls, broken by the harshness of the West, became husband and wife. It was not an ending, as many marriages were in those days, but a beginning. Elias Sermanason, despite his limp and the recent ordeal, set to work with a quiet ferocity. The cabin, once a symbol of Clara's despair, was transformed under his diligent hands. Each day, he would meticulously repair another section of the sagging roof, or patch another hole in the walls. His hands, though rough and calloused, worked with a surprising tenderness, as if he were mending not just wood and stone, but a piece of his own soul. He moved slowly, deliberately, his stick thudding a steady rhythm against the earth, a testament to his unwavering commitment. Clara, in turn, found a new purpose. She meticulously tended her small vegetable garden, coaxing life from the arid soil. She mended Elias's worn shirts, her nimble fingers weaving new threads into old fabric. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with increasing clarity, her smile returned. It was a soft, genuine smile, a bloom in the desert that hadn't been seen since Samuel's death, a silent testament to the fragile hope Elias had brought into her life. The townsfolk, initially, scoffed. They were cynical, hardened by years of broken promises and fleeting illusions. They saw a crippled drifter and a vulnerable widow, a partnership doomed to fail. But as days turned into weeks, they began to witness something extraordinary. Elias and Clara didn't complain, didn't boast. They simply were. Their presence in the community was a quiet, unwavering force. When Elias went to the general store, he paid for his goods with scrupulous honesty, never haggling, never trying to cheat. He helped Mrs. Barlow, the aging laundress, carry her heavy baskets of clean clothes. He even, with his quiet skill, tended to old Mr. Johnson's limping horse. And Tibacanin, Sonatium, refusing payment. His kindness wasn't loud or ostentatious. It was a steady, unassuming flow, like a hidden spring beneath the dry earth. Slowly, imperceptibly, this kindness began to spread, a quiet ember igniting tiny sparks in the cold, hardened hearts of Pine Ridge. Then one quiet morning, as Clara sat by the fire, picking pin bones from a freshly caught fish, her hand instinctively went to her abdomen. A strange, fluttering sensation stirred within her, a feeling she had never known, yet instantly recognized. She froze, her breath catching. Disbelief warred with a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion she dared not hope. But 3 weeks later, when the persistent nausea and an unshakable weariness continued, she finally whispered to Elias, her voice barely audible, thick with a mixture of fear and wonder. We're going to have a baby. Elias, who had been whittling a piece of wood by the fire, stopped abruptly. He sat utterly still for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the crackle of the flames. Then Montuan, slowly, Termonin, he reached out and took her hand, his rough thumb stroking her knuckles. His eyes were ween, usually so guarded, filled with a raw, almost painful tenderness. He had lost so much in his life, had walked away from so much. Now, Anapun, to be given something so profoundly precious, so utterly unexpected. He couldn't quite believe that fortune. After all these years, still remembered his name. The fragile hope had blossomed into a real, tangible promise. Part der Fern, the gathering storm, a new threat. Chapter 7, The Fragile Promise and the Whispers of Return. The news of Clara's pregnancy settled over their small home like a warm, comforting blanket, bringing with it a quiet joy that transcended the harsh realities of Pine Ridge. Elias, though still a man of few words, moved with a renewed purpose. He worked tirelessly on the cabin, building a small, sturdy cradle with his own hands, his calloused fingers meticulously smoothing the wood. Clara, her belly swelling, nurtured her garden, humming soft, forgotten tunes as she watered the parched earth, coaxing life from it. And Kun, their love, born from adversity, deepened with each passing day, a quiet, abiding force that defied the cynicism of the outside world. The townsfolk, who had grown accustomed to their quiet acts of kindness, watched this development with a mixture of curiosity and a nascent sense of community. The arrival of a child, particularly in such a desolate place, was a rare and precious event. Elias's reputation as a stand-in husband was already taking root, not just as a man who stood against Silas Vane, but as a man who stood for something, for integrity, for decency, for family. He offered help where it was needed, shared his limited resources, and his actions, more than any words, began to slowly mend the frayed edges of Pine Ridge's social fabric. But tranquility in the West was a fleeting mirage, easily shattered. It was a brittle piece. To like dried tumbleweed, ready to be swept away by the next gust of harsh wind. One moonless night, as the coyotes howled their ancient songs from the distant mesas, the sound of a lone horse approaching broke the stillness. It was Old Man Fitzwilliam, the mail rider, his face etched with more lines than usual, his eyes wide with an urgency that defied his usual slow, methodical pace. He dismounted quickly, almost stumbling, and knocked on Elias and Clara's door with an unusual fervor. Elias, waiting. Clara, no other summer for emotions. His voice was raspy, filled with a desperate warning. Silas Vane ain't done, so he's back. And he's angrier than a cornered grizzly. Fitzwilliam's words tumbled out, breathless and urgent. He's gathered a new crew from Deadwater. They say, worse than the last lot. Wanted men, no respect for law or life. Rumors are flying. He's coming back to Pine Ridge. Says the deal was cheated. Amas says he's gonna take what's rightfully his. He paused, his gaze falling to Clara's visibly rounded belly. And he's talking about Clara. Says she's his property. Clara's blood ran cold. The old fear, a specter she thought she had banished, rushed back, tightening its icy grip around her heart. Her hands flew to her abdomen, instinctively shielding the precious life within. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't hide. But Elias, though his jaw tightened, showed no outward sign of fear. His gaze remained steady, fixed on the distant, unseen threat. He placed a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder, his grip firm. "If he comes back," Elias said, his voice low, a rumbling promise. "He'll find this place ain't a place for plunder anymore. This is home, and home must be defended." His words were not a boast, but a quiet, unbreakable vow. Chapter 8. Fortifying the Last Stand. The news of Silas Vane's impending return sent a chill through Pine Ridge, shattering the fragile peace that had begun to take root. For Elias, there was no hesitation, no question of flight. This was his home, his family, and he would stand for them. He immediately began to fortify their small cabin, transforming it from a simple dwelling into a makeshift fortress. Despite the lingering ache in his shoulder from the previous confrontation and the persistent pain in his limping leg, he worked with an unwavering intensity, driven by a powerful, primal urge to protect. He used every piece of spare timber, every loose rock. Windows were boarded up, thick planks nailed across them, leaving only narrow slits for observation and defense. The main door, already sturdy, was reinforced with heavy crossbeams, making it an unyielding barrier. Elias meticulously cleaned his old shotgun, its metal gleaming dully in the lamplight. He checked his limited supply of ammunition. Then, Aitinman, with practiced hands, began molding new lead bullets from scavenged scraps, each one a silent prayer for accuracy. His movements were precise, efficient, born of a past he rarely spoke of, but which had clearly taught him the brutal necessities of survival. Despite her growing belly and the physical discomfort that came with it, refused to be a burden. She watched Elias, her heart swelling with a fierce admiration and a desperate need to contribute. She knew her role was not just to wait. Elias had given her a small, well-oiled pistol, and Clara, with trembling hands, began to learn how to load it, how to cock the hammer, how to aim. She practiced in the quiet hours, out of sight, aiming at old tin cans, the loud reports jarring her nerves. Her hands ached, her shoulders bruised from the recoil, but she persisted. Her eyes, though often blurred with tears of fear, never wavering. She would fight for her child, for her home, for the man who had shown her what it meant to live. As days passed, the rumors of Silas Vane's approach intensified, carried on the wind from distant settlements. The townsfolk of Pine Ridge reacted with a mixture of fear, resignation, and a growing sense of uneasy anticipation. Some huddled in their homes, convinced that resistance was futile. Others, hardened by years of Vane's tyranny, considered packing their own bags, hoping to escape before the inevitable clash. But then, a surprising thing began to happen. The quiet acts of kindness Elias had sown now began to bear fruit. Old Man Greaves, the weathered farmer whose horse Elias had tended, was the first to appear, carrying a sack of cornmeal and a box of old rifle cartridges. Then came May Porter, her usual gruffness softened by grim determination, bringing bandages and fresh water. Slowly, one by one, others followed. The blacksmith, whose forge Elias had helped repair. A young couple Elias had offered shelter to when their own claim failed. Even the saloon keeper, who brought a bottle of medicinal whiskey and a promise of support. They were a small, unlikely band, but they came with a quiet resolve, their faces grim but determined. "If he comes, Elias, Mr. Greaves said, his voice rough but firm. "We stand with you. This ain't just your fight anymore." Elias looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on their faces, seeing not fear, but a flicker of the very hope he had tried to rekindle in this desolate town. A community, slowly, painfully, was being forged in the crucible of impending conflict. They didn't speak of heroism, they spoke of home. Part 4. The Fires of Trial, a Community Forged. Chapter 9. The Dawn of Reckoning. The air on the morning of the third day after Old Man Fitzwilliam's warning was thick, not just with dust, but with an almost palpable tension. Every living soul in Pine Ridge held their breath, poised on the knife edge of expectation. The sun Chenim, a lurid orange disk, climbed slowly above the distant mesas, casting long, menacing shadows across the parched landscape. And then, its Surinman, a faint smudge appeared on the horizon, a rising cloud of dust that grew steadily larger, slowly coalescing into the unmistakable shapes of riders. 7 of them, distinct and menacing, against the backdrop of the emerging dawn. At their head rode Silas Vane, a figure of grim determination. His grizzled beard was flecked with dust, and his eyes, like embers, burned with a cold fury. He wore a dark duster, its edges flapping in the morning breeze, and a large heavy rifle was slung across his saddle. His new crew, a Shishonen erasing arm, fresh from the lawless territories of Deadwater, looked every bit as ruthless as the rumors had suggested. Lean, hard-bitten men with the cold, calculating eyes of professional killers, they rode with an arrogant confidence, believing that Pine Ridge, like all other places, would bend or break before Silas's will. They stopped a safe distance from Elias's fortified cabin, forming a menacing semicircle. Silas dismounted, his boots kicking up clouds of dust, and walked a few steps forward, his voice a booming challenge that echoed across the stillness of the dawn. "Indicate, sir, me." "Clara," he roared, his voice laced with possessive fury. "Come on, better come out. You are mine." There was no reply from the silent cabin. The boarded windows stared back, blind and defiant. Then Westerber Mierman, slowly, deliberately, the front door of the cabin creaked open. Elias Thorne stepped out onto the porch. He was no longer the limping, quiet stranger of old. He stood tall, his stance unwavering, a man rooted to the earth. The old shotgun, clean and ready, was held loosely in his hands, its barrels reflecting the nascent light. He wore no hat, his dark hair falling across his brow, and his face, though grim, showed no trace of fear. He looked less like a man about to fight, and more like an ancient tree, unyielding against the storm. "Leave this land, Silas." Elias's voice was low, deep, and steady, cutting through Silas's bluster like a cold blade. "This is my land, my family's land." His words were a simple declaration, but they carried the weight of everything he had fought for, everything he had built. Silas let out a harsh, contemptuous laugh. He couldn't believe this cripple dared to stand against him. "I took your husband's life. Clarissa Deria Warnstorm," he sneered, his eyes flicking towards the cabin, a taunt aimed squarely at the woman he knew was listening. "I won't mind taking another." His words were the spark. The first shot rang out, a sudden, deafening crack that shattered the morning's peace. Tour Chapter 10, Tyranny Sim. The short, fierce battle and its aftermath. The battle, though brief, unfolded with a terrifying intensity. It was a maelstrom of gunfire, dust, and desperate courage. Clara, despite her advanced pregnancy, proved to be a formidable defender. From a narrow firing slit in the fortified window, she sighted her pistol, her hands trembling, but her aim steady. She squeezed the trigger, and one of Silas's men crumpled to the ground, a surprised look frozen on his face. Tears streamed down Clara's face, blurring her vision, but she reloaded, her resolve hardened by a primal need to protect the life within her. Elias, moving with a speed that belied his limp, was a force of quiet devastation. He had positioned himself strategically, using the reinforced porch as cover. He fired his shotgun with deadly accuracy, each blast echoing like thunder. One of Silas's men, attempting to flank him, fell with a choked cry. Another, into return, rushing the porch, was met with a brutal, close-range blast that sent him sprawling. Elias took a glancing blow to the shoulder, a searing pain, but he barely registered it. His focus was absolute. A stray bullet grazed his forehead, drawing a thin line of blood, but he merely shook his head. His eyes narrowed into slits of unwavering determination. Silas Vane, enraged by the unexpected resistance and the loss of his men, roared with fury. He dismounted, drawing his own pistol, and charged the porch, driven by a blinding desire for vengeance and possession. He kicked at the reinforced door, aiming to breach the last defense. But as he burst through the splintered frame, he found Elias waiting. The shotgun was still in Elias's hands, its twin barrels now pressed firmly against Silas's chest, inches from his heart. The tables had turned. I will spare you, Elias said, his voice raw, edged with a weariness that belied the recent ferocity. He looked into Silas's burning eyes, seeing not just evil, but a hollow emptiness. But if you ever return, not even the devil will save you. It was a promise, chilling in its quiet certainty. Silas, utterly defeated, stood frozen, the cold metal of the shotgun against his skin a stark reminder of his mortality. Within minutes, the rest of Silas's men, leaderless and demoralized, broke and ran, scrambling onto their horses and disappearing into the rising dust. Silas Vane, now bound hand and foot, was delivered to the newly arrived and conveniently late sheriff from a neighboring county, who had finally been convinced to ride out after the desperate pleas of Mr. Greaves the sheriff. Her son, looking pale and nervous, took Silas into custody, his eyes wide with surprise at the sight of the defeated rancher. As the sheriff led Silas away, the last echoes of gunfire faded, and the morning sun climbed higher, breaking through the lingering smoke. A new day had truly dawned over Pine Ridge. Chapter 11. The quiet aftermath and the deepening bonds. When the smoke finally cleared and the last hoofbeats of the fleeing outlaws faded into the distant horizon, what remained was not the exhilaration of victory, but the quiet devastation of its cost. Elias and Clara's small cabin, though it had stood firm against the assault, bore the deep scars of the battle. The porch was scorched, blackened by gunpowder residue and near misses. Bullet holes peppered the walls, like silent, gaping mouths screaming reminders of the violence. The careful repairs Elias had painstakingly made were now undone, the very fabric of their newly built life torn and tattered. And Elias, the man who had stood like a bulwark against the storm, now lay still in their small bedroom, his body aching, bandaged tightly around his shoulder, and a fresh, deep gash marking his forehead. He was utterly exhausted, the adrenaline having drained from his system, leaving him pale and weak. Clara sat beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his rough, calloused one. Long nights before, she had feared the profound loneliness that had become her constant companion. Now, a different, sharper fear gripped her, the fear of losing him, the man who had brought light back into her desolate world. She watched his chest rise and fall, listened to his shallow breaths, and prayed with a fervor she hadn't known she possessed. Slowly, Elias's eyes fluttered open, his lips cracked and dry. His voice was a rasp, barely a whisper. "You're still here?" Clara nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "And I'm not going anywhere," she murmured, her voice breaking. It was a simple exchange, yet it held the weight of their shared journey, their intertwined destinies. Outside, the first signs of communal healing were already underway. May Porter and Old Man Greaves, two of the staunchest allies, were already toiling on the porch, their movements slow but determined. They re-erected the shattered doorframe, nailed new planks over the bullet holes, each hammer blow a quiet testament to shared resolve, a silent act of mending. Other townsfolk, who had previously been too fearful to openly aid Elias, now appeared with quiet offerings. Furnish-free, fresh water, food, old blankets. The conflict had ignited a spark within the community, forging an unspoken bond among them. Later that evening, Clara stoked the fire in the hearth, her hands still trembling from the lingering tension, but her movements purposeful. She spooned warm cornmeal gruel into a bowl, gently blowing on it to cool it, then brought it to Elias. He ate slowly, each spoonful a small reclamation of strength, a sip of renewed life. "You don't have to do all this," Elias whispered, concerned for her weariness. Clara leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I'm not doing it all," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "We are together." As night deepened, Clara sat alone by the scorched threshold, wrapped in a blanket, the sliver of a crescent moon casting an ethereal glow on the cracked earth. She recalled everything: Samuel's death, Silas's threats, the harrowing gunfight. She should not have survived this, but she had, and not just for herself. Her hand instinctively went to her swollen belly. The child within, precious and fragile, remained peaceful, as if understanding that their world had just weathered a terrifying nightmare. Elias was still limping slightly, but moving with determined steps, shuffled out to join her. His shoulder was bandaged, his expression still serious, etched with the memory of the recent violence. He said nothing, simply pulled up a wooden chair and sat beside her. They didn't need words. In that profound silence, something subtle yet powerful was quietly growing. Not the festering of wounds, but the blossoming of faith, faith in their shared future, in the resilience of their spirits, and in the quiet strength of their unspoken love. Part 4. The Desert Bloom, a community forged anew. Chapter 12. The quiet resurgence of Pine Ridge. Autumn arrived in Pine Ridge not with roaring winds or torrential rains, but with the crisp, clean silence of early mornings. The cottonwood trees along the dusty creek bed began to blush with amber and gold, their leaves shimmering like discarded coins in the gentle breeze. The ground that once was still parched, had nevertheless absorbed the lessons of the recent turmoil, and a cautious calm had settled over the hearts of the townspeople. Clary Ray, now heavily pregnant, sat by the window, her nimble fingers working on a small, soft cotton blanket. Her embroidery, intended to be a simple heart, was unfinished, for the needle would often tremble when the child within her stirred. A gentle flutter against her ribs. Her face, though still bearing the faint lines of past grief, was now soft, radiant with anticipation. Her eyes, once filled with storms, now held a deep, quiet serenity. You know, she whispered to her unborn child, her voice a soft murmur. I once thought I would never again be able to call anyone family. Elias stood behind her, a glass of cool water in his hand, which he gently placed beside her. He leaned down, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. You talk to it as if it understands, he murmured, a rare smile playing on his lips. Clara turned her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Perhaps it does. We have no one else to tell our stories to, but each other. Their shared silence. Their shared vulnerabilities. Bound them closer than any legal document ever could. The first pang of labor struck on a misty, moonless night. Clara doubled over, biting down hard on a corner of her blanket to stifle a cry. Elias jolted awake, fumbling from the bed, stumbling momentarily on his injured leg. He had faced armed men, gunfights, and the harsh realities of the wilderness without flinching. But the sight of Clara, slick with sweat, her eyes clouded with pain, sent a raw, unfamiliar panic surging through him. I'll fetch old man Greaves' wife, and Mrs. Yuna, he stammered, already moving towards the door. No time, Clara gasped, grasping his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. The baby, it's coming now. Elias sprang into action, his panic quickly replaced by a focused determination. He lit the fire in the hearth, set water to boil, and frantically prepared the bed with clean linens. His hands trembled, but his movements were efficient, drawing on instincts born of a past life. Perhaps, his eyes remained fixed on Clara, watching every strained breath, every contortion of her face. This woman, once fragile, then fiercely resilient, was now a warrior bringing life into the world. The labor was long and arduous, the pains coming in relentless waves, crashing against Clara like a relentless tide against a rocky shore. Clara bit her lip until it bled, her fingers digging into Elias's wrist, clinging to him as if he were the only anchor in a world spun out of control. I can't do it, she sobbed in a moment of watery despair, her voice thick with pain and exhaustion. You faced Silas, Elias whispered back, his voice hoarse with encouragement, his gaze unwavering. You stood in the fire. You can do this. His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink of surrender. And then a cry, small, radiant about 129, yet it echoed through the quiet cabin like the first bell tolling in a long silent town. A cry of life, fragile yet undeniably present. Elias, one in words, trembling, carefully wrapped the tiny, squalling infant in the still unfinished embroidered blanket. He didn't dare hold her fully, simply leaned over, gazing down, a pair of eyes, still closed, a wisp of dark brown hair, and tiny fists clenched tightly. Clara opened her eyes, exhausted but strangely bright, a luminescence born of fierce love and profound relief. Her name is Hope, she whispered, her voice weak but firm. Why Hope? Elias asked, kneeling beside the bed, like a pilgrim before a sacred miracle. Because she's the only thing I never dared to keep for myself. But today, I have her. The sky was just beginning to lighten when Elias stepped out onto the porch, cradling the still warm blanket in his arms. A gentle breeze rustled through his hair, carrying the mingled scents of damp earth, newborn skin, sweat, and the faint tang of blood. But to Elias, it was the undeniable fragrance of life. Old man Greaves, walking his slow morning rounds, paused at the sight of Elias. Mother and child well, he asked, his voice filled with a rare, unspoken concern. Elias simply nodded, a silent, profound understanding passing between the two men. There was no smile on Elias's face, but in his eyes, a light shone that had never been there before in the lost, solitary man. A girl, Elias said, his voice husky. Her name is Hope. Old man Greaves looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, then back at Elias, a knowing look on his weathered face. Pine Ridge needs a name like that, he murmured. That evening, Clara held Hope in her arms, her strength slowly returning. Elias knelt beside the bed, his hand gently touching Clara's hair. Thank you, he said, his voice raw with emotion, for not giving up. Thank you, she replied, her voice soft, for not leaving me alone again. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, a gentle lullaby began to rise, Clara's voice, singing a haunting tune her own mother had once sung in far-off Yuma. Elias sat and listened, watching the tiny child nuzzle contentedly, his heart swelling with an emotion he had never known. And in that moment, he understood. The hardest battle was not against external evil, but learning to believe he was worthy of goodness. Part 16, The Living Legend, A Promise Kept. Chapter 13, Building Beyond Walls. Time in Pine Ridge didn't rush by like a city clock. It moved slowly, deliberately, like an old wooden timepiece needing to be wound each morning. But after the shootout, and especially after the birth of Little Hope, the town and the people within it began to transform in ways no one could have foreseen. Elias and Clara's cabin was no longer just a refuge. It became the quiet heart of something deeper, a silent, pervasive hope. Elias, with his tireless hands and unwavering dedication, rebuilt the chicken coop. Better and stronger than before, he would often cradle Hope in one arm while hammering nails with the other, his back soaked with honest sweat. In turn, meticulously sewed new curtains from leftover scraps of Hope's swaddling cloths. And her garden, once a symbol of struggle, now flourished, a vibrant testament to resilience. Every small act was a brick laid in the foundation of their lives, built not just with wood and earth, but with perseverance and love. Hope grew as swiftly as a beanstalk in springtime, her first wobbly steps, then her playful chases after the chickens, making Elias forget the very existence of his walking stick. And gradually, the whispers began to spread, from the isolated horse relays to the next town, from the lips of a lone stagecoach driver to the hands of a traveling mail carrier. The story of the man who faced down a tyrant for his wife with a shotgun and a promise became more than just a local anecdote. It began to morph into a legend. And legends, as they say, have a way of breathing their own life into the world. A wandering balladeer, a dusty figure who strummed a worn guitar and sang of heroic deeds, heard the tale. He wove it into a simple, heartfelt ballad, singing it in Santa Fe, then carrying it to El Paso, and further still, to dusty saloons and lonely campfire gatherings across the West. His lyrics were plain, unadorned, but they resonated with a deep, universal truth. She wore scars like a wedding dress, but he saw past every wound. He bought her life back with a vow and stood where no man would. The song took root. People no longer called Elias the quiet cripple. They called him the stand-in husband, a man who stood, not just physically, but morally. Clara first heard the ballad from a passing merchant family who stopped at their general store. She listened, her hands clasped tightly, a lump in her throat. She didn't cry, but she hugged Little Hope fiercely, as if every past pain she had endured was now. Finally, soothed by the voice of a stranger, the song, echoing across the vast distances, drew people to Pine Ridge. Folks began to believe that where Elias stood, there was safety. A young family, dispossessed from their own farm by a ruthless landowner, arrived, seeking refuge. Elias, without a moment's hesitation, offered them his newly built grain shed, helping them erect a smaller lean-to for himself. An old man, his wife recently lost to the harsh elements, arrived one day, seeking work, saying he just needed a place to die in peace. Clara, her eyes soft with understanding, offered him a warm cup of tea. "This place," she said gently, "is not for those who await death. It is for those who are ready to begin again." People came, then people stayed, and Pine Ridge began to change. Not because of new laws or a booming economy, but because of a simple cabin at the end of a dusty road. One day, the old sheriff from Dry Creek, a gruff, semi-norm, cynical man who had seen too much injustice to believe in anything good, rode up to Elias's place. He dismounted, watching Elias split wood, his movements still slow but powerful. "I never believed in justice out here in the desert," the sheriff admitted, his voice rough. "But it seems, here, it has taken shape." Elias simply bent his head, a small, humble smile playing on his lips. "We didn't build justice. No, Sheriff, we just kept it from falling away again." The world outside remained a place of gunsmoke and greed. But in Pine Ridge, people were rebuilding from the shattered fragments of their lives. No one hung a sign proclaiming, "Welcome to Freedom Valley." But everyone felt its presence, its silent, unwavering promise. And every evening, as the last rays of sunset poured over their porch, as Hope's infectious giggles filled the air, as Elias sat whittling wooden horses for the neighborhood children, they didn't know they had become living legends. Part 7, The Unwritten Legacy, A Love That Lasts. Chapter 14, The Heart of the Home, The Door of Love. Pine Ridge, late winter. A soft blanket of snow dusted the rooftops, not enough to impede movement, but just enough to bring a pristine hush, a gentle sense of peace to the weary land. The cottonwood trees, bare-limbed and stark, reached their skeletal branches towards the sky, like hands clasped in silent prayer. The air was crisp, clean, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the hearths and the promise of renewal. Inside their cabin, warm and inviting, Clara Jennings Thorne hummed softly as she tucked a thick quilt around little Hope. Now almost 3, the child, still prone to waking with small cries, found comfort in the feel of her mother's finger clasped tightly in her tiny hand, as if fearing that if she let go, everything would vanish. Hope's steady breathing was the sweetest symphony Clara had ever known. Elias sat by the roaring fire, meticulously sharpening a wooden chisel, preparing to carve another one of his small, intricate animal figures for Hope or the other children who now frequented their home. The firelight danced across his weathered cheekbones, highlighting the lines etched by time and hardship, scars he no longer bothered to hide. The old fears, the sudden hoofbeats on the horizon, the chilling whisper of Silas Vane's name, the constant vigilance against attack had faded into the background, replaced by the mundane, precious rhythms of daily life. Now, they measured their days not by impending threats, but by simple, profound joys. Hope's infectious laughter as she chased the chickens, her boundless energy a constant source of wonder, the comforting aroma of Clara's cornbread baking each morning, filling the cabin with warmth. Elias's quiet stories of catching a wild snake he mistook for a rope, told with a rare, gentle humor that always made Hope giggle, and those quiet, precious evenings, sitting together by the fire, not needing words, yet understanding everything. Their love, once a fragile seedling, had grown into a mighty tree, its roots deep and strong. One evening, Clara spoke, her voice soft with reflection. "You know, Elias," she said, gazing at the flickering flames, "I used to dream of a home with a strong, locked door. Now what an eternity. Our home has no lock, and yet I feel safer than I ever have." Elias looked at her, his eyes, usually so serious, softened with understanding. He nodded slowly. "Because the keeper of the door isn't the lock, Clara." He said, his voice a low rumble. "It's love." That night, after Hope had finally drifted into a deep sleep, Clara saw Elias open the old wooden chest. He took out a small, worn box, its lid secured with a simple clasp. He opened it, and inside, nestled on a piece of faded cloth, was a simple silver ring. It was crudely fashioned, slightly bent and uneven, clearly handmade, but polished to a clean, soft gleam. "I made it," Elias said, his voice tinged with an uncharacteristic shyness. "From an old knife handle. You don't have to wear it if you don't like it." His gaze flickered away. a rare display of vulnerability. Clara said nothing. Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached into the box. She carefully picked up the ring, its cold metal warming quickly against her skin. She slid it onto her left ring finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "It's more beautiful than anything I've ever owned," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes welling up with tears. Elias let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of profound relief and quiet joy. Then there was Sipitover, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. He said, his voice low and steady, filled with a love that had bloomed from the arid ground of hardship. "Then, let me marry you again. Clacrimum pri, Sir Permanano. Not for the law, not for protection, but because I truly, deeply love you." Clara laughed, a soft, tearful sound that was both joyful and knowing. "I suppose I should have made you wait longer for those words," she teased. "But I said yes to you 3 years ago." They didn't have a grand ceremony. It was a simple, heartfelt gathering of their closest friends and neighbors, the community they had helped to build. A small meal was shared, humble but abundant. Hope, with her boundless energy, gathered a bouquet of wildflowers from the banks of the creek, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the winter landscape. And underneath the sheltering branches of the old cottonwood tree, where Elias had first shielded Clara from Silas Vane, they shared a long, tender embrace, a silent reaffirmation of their enduring bond. Spring arrived shortly after, bringing with it a burst of new life. Wildflowers bloomed along the dusty paths, a riot of color that defied the desert's harshness. Bees buzzed lazily among Clara's flourishing vegetable patch. Clara taught Hope to read, her patient voice guiding the child through the mysteries of letters. Passing on a legacy of knowledge and curiosity, Elias continued to expand their farm, adding more sheep, his tireless work a testament to his commitment to their future. And occasionally, a stranger would ride through Pine Ridge, a dusty wanderer drawn by rumors or a need for shelter. They would often stop at Elias and Clara's thriving farm, curious about the story that had grown around this quiet place. "Is this, or?" they would ask, their voices tinged with wonder. "Surinaturnasinarnus, the place where there was once a gunfight for a wife." "None, no," Clara would answer. "Unt the Shushurananto," her voice gentle but firm, her eyes meeting theirs with a quiet wisdom. "This is the place where people learned how to love again, after they had forgotten how to live." The lives of Elias and Clara Thorne were never written into history books. They didn't become legendary figures in grand sagas of the Wild West. But their story lived on, woven into the very fabric of Pine Ridge. Every child born in that town, every harvest shared among neighbors, every letter sent to distant lands, carried a trace of their legacy. They started with remnants, a widow shattered by loss, a man burdened by his past mistakes. And then they built a home, not with walls of brick, but with the unwavering strength of human hearts. It became a place where, no matter how fierce the storm, people dared to stand, and to love, and to live. Epilogue, the whisper that endures. Some folks will tell you the American West was a land of only guns, dust, and men who knew nothing of tenderness. They speak of lawlessness and endless strife. But every now and then, even in the most unforgiving, parched landscapes, something gentle takes root, like a tender shoot pushing through cracked earth. If you ever find yourself riding through the vast, quiet expanse of New Mexico and happen upon the small, unassuming town of Pine Ridge, look closely. And if you see a humble wooden cabin on the edge of town, its porch adorned with vibrant wild daisies, stop for a moment. Perhaps, if you listen carefully, you might just hear the clear, joyful laughter of a child playing in the yard, or the low, Tijuana steady voice of a man telling a story in the fading evening light. And you might glimpse the shadows of two figures, sitting side by side on their porch, or by the warm glow of the hearth, not needing to speak, yet understanding everything. Because sometimes the greatest legends don't need to be shouted from the rooftops. They simply need to be lived, day by day,